Welcome, traveller of time. Lay down your burdens now. Let the static of modern life dissolve into the stillness that waits just behind the curtain of sleep. Breathe. The air may be silent, but it hums with the echoes of long-lost centuries. Tonight we do not search for answers. We drift, we listen, we remember. Not with urgency, but with gentleness. For history, like sleep, comes softly when we stop reaching for it. If stories like this quiet your thoughts, you're always welcome to stay, or simply listen and let your mind carry you. And so, with a quiet breath, let us begin. The year was 536 AD, and across the known world the sun refused to rise. In the morning the sky glowed not with golden light, but with a heavy, muted grey. The kind of grey that feels like the world has forgotten to wake up. Birds were quiet. Shadows no longer stretched across fields, and day after day, night seemed to linger far too long. In Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, the people blinked toward the heavens and whispered fearful prayers. Why, they asked, has the sun been taken from us? No answer came. Not in the wheat fields of Gaul. Not in the icy fjords of the north. Not in the forests of China or the highlands of Ireland. Everywhere the sky dimmed, and the earth held its breath. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a sun that gave no light. He called it eerie, like a wan moon. Crops withered, winds cooled, and across continents the seasons blurred into one long winter. No one knew why. There were no satellites to chart volcanic plumes, no meteorologists to track the sun's light. Only terrified farmers, bewildered emperors, and freezing children staring into a sky that no longer warmed them. The world, they said, had broken. And in a way, they were right. The people of the 6th century had no way to name what was happening to them. They did not speak of climate events or volcanic aerosols. They did not debate science in scrolls or gather around maps of pressure systems. Instead, they turned to the only explanations they had ever known: the wrath of gods, the trembling of omens, and the slow unraveling of divine order. In distant villages and mighty cities alike, priests and soothsayers gazed into the darkened sky and declared, this was no ordinary eclipse. This was judgment. And still the sky remained hushed. Across Europe and Asia, the sun remained dimmed for over a year. The Irish annals wrote of a failure of bread in 536. The Chinese chronicles spoke of yellow dust that rained down from the heavens. In the Middle East, there were reports of an unseen veil cloaking the earth. Even in Mesoamerica, far across oceans never yet mapped by those who ruled in Rome, tree rings tell us of a year when growth halted. A year when nature seemed to pause. A year when hunger crept into every valley and the skies bore witness to sorrow. What had happened? Modern science offers a revelation the people of 536 could never have imagined. Somewhere in the northern hemisphere, possibly in Iceland, a massive volcanic eruption tore through the earth. It cast millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, high above the clouds, where it formed a global shroud. Sunlight, once a promise of growth and life, was now scattered, weakened, fractured before it could kiss the ground. And the consequences were catastrophic. The world entered a volcanic winter. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists would later discover entire regions abandoned, farms deserted, villages lost to time. The Norse sagas, written centuries later, whisper of Fimbulwinter, a great cold that foretells the end of all things. Perhaps these were more than stories. Perhaps they were memories. In China, snow fell in midsummer. Crops failed in succession. In Mesopotamia, trade slowed and then stopped. Rivers ran low. Granaries emptied. And as the famine deepened, hope became rationed alongside barley and rice. It was not only the cold or the dim light that plagued the world. It was the uncertainty, the absence of meaning. What happens when the very rhythm of time changes, when the dawn forgets to arrive and the seasons turn in silence? In Rome, already weakened by centuries of decline, the once proud imperial institutions struggled to maintain order. Justinian I, the emperor in Constantinople, ruled over a world that was beginning to break not from war, but from the slow decay of nature's balance. The air grew dry in some places, soaked in others. The balance of ecosystems shifted. Locusts surged where they hadn't before, and food became a memory rather than a guarantee. But the worst was still to come, because the darkness and famine of 536 were only the beginning. The earth would tremble again, twice more, in the years that followed. In 540 and 547, more volcanic eruptions would erupt into the stratosphere, compounding the misery. It was as if the sky itself had turned against the people below. The Earth had entered what some scholars now call the late antique Little Ice Age, a span of over a century in which temperatures fell, harvests failed, and empires weakened. The scars left behind were not just physical, but spiritual. You must imagine it. A boy born in 536 in the hills of Anatolia grows up never knowing a proper summer. His father speaks of warmer days with nostalgia, but the boy has never felt heat on his face. His village shrinks each year, food is never abundant, and when he asks why the sun is so pale, the elders simply shake their heads. It was not always like this, they say, but no one can remember when it was. And as the decades pass, something darker begins to stir, far beyond the hunger, beyond the cold. It begins not in the sky, but in the blood. A new spectre is rising, one born of rats, of fleas, of ships and market stalls and unseen breaths carried on the wind, a plague. But before we speak of death in its most silent form, we must linger for a moment longer in the famine, in the hunger that turned noblemen into beggars, that saw cities rot from the inside out. For this was a time when the earth had closed her hand, and all who dwelled upon it lived in the absence of light, warmth and mercy. The famine did not arrive with violence, it crept. There were no great battles, no horns of war or sieges echoing through mountains. Instead, it was a stillness. A slow, gnawing quiet that spread across continents like a whisper between dying trees. In the valleys of Gaul, the wheat fields yellowed too soon. The rain arrived too late, and when the people gathered for harvest, they found their baskets light and their hands empty. Children cried at dusk not for toys or comfort, but for bread, and the cries too eventually quieted. In the highlands of Ethiopia, the rivers slowed to a trickle, trade routes fell into disuse. Markets no longer bustled with grain sellers and fruit vendors. Donkeys brayed beside empty carts. The streets were not filled with revolution or resistance, but with a quiet surrender to absence. No one escaped untouched, not kings, not monks, not merchants or soldiers. Even the Byzantine Empire, still cloaked in gold and the illusion of stability, felt its seams begin to tear. Justinian, first known as the emperor who sought to reclaim Rome's former glory, faced a growing tide of discontent. His armies marched toward distant borders, yet at home his people starved. And into this brittle world, thin with hunger, cold with volcanic shadow, heavy with unspoken grief, came something far worse. It began, as all great plagues do, in places no one was watching. A dock worker in Pelusium, Egypt perhaps, or a merchant returning from the Red Sea with his hands full of silk and his cloak full of fleas. A cough, a fever, a swelling behind the ear. Then another, and another. They called it pestis, the scourge. We call it the Plague of Justinian. It arrived in 541 AD, 5 years after the darkening of the skies. It did not knock. It seeped. It clung to grain sacks, slipped into sleeping quarters, rode with sailors and crept into temples. It passed silently from breath to breath, blood to blood. At first it was a mystery. Then it was everywhere. In Constantinople, tens of thousands died within weeks. The city, already fragile from famine, could not comprehend the speed. Corpses piled in the streets, mass graves filled, and soon there was no one left to dig. The air turned sweet with rot. The prayers grew desperate. The emperor himself, Justinian, fell ill. He recovered, but many did not. The dead were not mourned individually. They were counted, then buried, or, when space ran out, burned. And the smoke, already thick with ash from years past, now carried the scent of humanity's undoing. Outside the capital, the plague radiated outward like cracks in cold glass. To the villages of Anatolia, where shepherds collapsed beside their flocks. To the coasts of Italy, where church bells rang until no one remained to ring them. To the far reaches of Persia, North Africa and the Levant, where even the might of the Sassanid Empire bowed before death's quiet march. Some say nearly half the population of the Eastern Roman Empire perished, not once but in waves, a plague that returned again and again for the next 2 centuries. The land itself seemed exhausted, as if the earth had opened its arms not in welcome, but in surrender. And what of the people? How does a mother explain to her child why the sun no longer shines? Why the bread is gone? Why their sister lies still and does not stir? How do elders speak of hope when the seasons have forgotten their name? They told stories. They carved prayers. They burned incense. They wept and held hands and watched stars flicker in the sky like dying candles, and in time they adapted, because they had no choice. But the memory remained, passed in whispers, embedded in bones, encoded in the ice and in the rings of ancient trees. A memory of a time when the world dimmed and everything slowed. When life itself became fragile, and silence was no longer peace but prophecy. This was not merely a year of suffering, it was the turning of an age, an invisible hinge upon which history turned, quietly and with devastating weight. Even as the ash settled and the worst of the plague's first wave receded, the world that remained was no longer the one that came before. The forests had grown thicker in places once cleared by man. Roads fell silent. Statues stood unvisited. Markets that once overflowed with figs, olives and spices now sat empty, their stalls collapsed under the weight of neglect. But it was not just the physical world that had changed. It was the very spirit of humanity. In the vacuum left behind by the Great Forgetting, new beliefs began to grow. Where once emperors ruled by divine favor and philosophers debated under the sun, now prophets, monks and mystics wandered the ruins, carrying only their voices and the memory of fire. In the Byzantine world, Christianity grew not only in doctrine but in desperation. The suffering was so immense, so incomprehensible, that people looked skyward for reasons, for structure. Saints were made from survivors. Martyrs were found in alleyways. Icons were painted not just for beauty but for begging, for protection from a sky that had gone dark. Elsewhere, old religions twisted and bent under the weight of silence. Zoroastrian fire temples burned dimmer, pagan shrines crumbled. Even in far-off lands untouched by Roman borders, the wind carried whispers of change. In India, records from the time grow sparse as if memory itself struggled to survive. In China, the once rich Silk Road stuttered to a halt. The emperors of the Northern Wei dynasty, already torn by internal chaos, watched as crops failed and rebellions rose. In Scandinavia, a place often silent in the great annals of history, archaeologists have found something extraordinary. Vast sacrifices buried in peat bogs, entire warships burned, treasures given back to the earth. It is as though, in the cold and in the absence of reason, the people turned inward, to blood, to fire, to myth. Perhaps they believed their world had ended, and in a sense it had. For historians today, 536 AD is not merely a date, it is a fracture, the beginning of a global climatic anomaly, a point on the timeline where human progress, trade, art and empire did not evolve but unraveled. The years that followed brought no quick return. Another volcanic eruption in 540 AD, its location still debated, deepened the chill. A third in 547. It was as if the earth, wounded deeply, kept exhaling sorrow. The consequences would stretch beyond lifetimes. The plague would continue, appearing in waves until nearly the 8th century. The Western Roman legacy, already crumbling, would be lost to what we now call the Dark Ages. The intricate systems of the ancient world, grain supplies from Egypt, trade routes from India, knowledge passed down in libraries, would dim like lamps running out of oil. Yet even in this long winter of civilization, something survived. In cold monasteries, monks copied texts by candlelight. In half-empty villages, elders told stories by hearths. In palaces and ruins alike, seeds were stored. Children were born, names were spoken. There is a strange beauty in this resilience. In the way that even in a world cloaked in ash and silence, life found its rhythm. Perhaps that is what truly defines us, not the splendor of empires or the brightness of suns, but the quiet, stubborn continuation of breath, even when the sky forgets to shine. And so the world turned, slowly, heavily, quietly, but it turned. Centuries have passed since that darkened year, and yet the echoes remain, not in headlines or memory, but in the quietest corners of the world. In ice cores drawn from the glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists have discovered layers of ash and sulfur from the 6th century, evidence frozen in time. Like pages in the diary of the Earth itself, these layers tell a story of sudden cold, of atmospheric violence, of a planet in mourning, and in tree rings the memories go deeper still. A tree grows outward in circles, each ring a record of a year lived. In the years following 536, the rings are tight, narrow bands of barely their growth from trees across the Northern Hemisphere, in Ireland, in Sweden, in Mongolia, in North America. Even the trees, it seems, remember, and so does the soil. Sediment layers tell us of rivers that ran dry, lakes that shrank, and farmlands abandoned. In places where human footprints once marched confidently across the land, time filled in the silence with moss, with stillness, with the long sleep of forgotten things. But nature was not the only one recording. In the stories passed down through generations, we find flickers of a memory too large to name. In the Nordic legends, there is Fimbulvita, the great winter that lasts 3 years and signals the end of the world. In Christian apocalyptic texts, there are signs in the sun, moon, and stars, omens of judgment. In Buddhist chronicles, there are tales of a black sun and of hunger so vast it turned the wheel of karma. These myths were not invented in comfort. They were born in the aftermath of fire and frost. And yet, when we look back upon them, there is something deeply human in our response to disaster. We do not simply fall. We narrate, we craft meaning from ruin, we assign shape to the shapeless. A year like 536 could have destroyed the spirit of a species. Instead, it reformed it. The world that emerged in the centuries after was colder, yes, more fractured, less connected, but it also became a crucible for change. The Islamic Golden Age, medieval Europe, Tang China, all would rise eventually from the long twilight that began in this century. New languages would evolve. New cities would be born, and even as the plague reappeared in cruel cycles, humanity continued to build and dream. It is easy to look at 536 and see only suffering, and there is truth in that. But perhaps in the quiet rhythm of survival, in the monasteries that preserved knowledge, in the households that lit a single candle against the dark, we find another kind of story. Not of conquest or glory, but of endurance. A whisper that says, we were here, we endured, and we remembered. Even now, when the skies dim before a storm or a long winter lingers too long, that ancestral fear stirs. The memory of 536, though buried, lives somewhere in the bones of us all. And maybe that is why we tell stories, to honor what survived, to make meaning of what didn't, to keep a flicker burning even when the sun forgets to rise. In the centuries that followed, the year 536 faded not in importance but into obscurity. Like a wound so old it no longer bleeds, only aches when the air grows cold. It did not leave behind monuments or kings worth remembering. There were no epic victories to record in gold leaf, no treaties signed beneath banners of triumph. Its legacy was different, quiet, unmarked, and yet vast. A legacy of absence. What we inherit from 536 is not glory. It is the shape of absence itself. It is in the gaps of chronicles where no harvests are listed. It is in the way old settlements were never rebuilt. It is in the blank years etched into parchment, monasteries falling silent, scribes leaving pages untouched. But absence does not mean nothingness. For those who survived, the memory became embedded in their rituals. In the way people began to pray with more desperation, in the way they buried their dead, in the way they passed on their stories, not as fables but as warnings. This was the dawn of a new psychology, where once humanity believed itself at the center of divine favor, now it walked with more caution. The earth, once seen as a source of dependable bounty, was now volatile. The heavens, once a comforting dome, could be torn. The future, once assumed, became a fragile possibility. And still people married, children laughed, villages rebuilt their walls, not just with stone, but with memory. In many ways, the world of 536 did not end. It was redefined. Consider this. A young woman born in 550 AD, 15 years after the worst famine, 10 years after the plague began, might grow up hearing stories of a sunless world. To her, those stories were not history, but myth. Her parents had survived something unimaginable, and she, raised in a time of rebuilding, might become a mother who plants seeds with trembling hope, aware now that nature remembers and sometimes forgets mercy. This new reverence for balance found its way into laws, into art, into theology. Some historians believe the events of this era helped accelerate the rise of monasticism, of mystic traditions, of deeper spiritual introspection across faiths. For when the world goes quiet, the soul begins to speak. And what it says is not always profound. Sometimes it simply asks, why? Why did the sky darken? Why did the bread vanish? Why did my sister not wake? These questions, unanswered in their time, remain with us. Not for their solutions, but for their presence. They humble us. They remind us that even the most advanced civilizations can lose their footing on the earth. Even today, we are not separate from such fragility. A volcanic eruption still has the power to blanket the globe in ash. A pandemic still has the power to hush entire cities. A year still has the power to become a hinge in history, a silent bend in the river of time. But the deeper legacy of 536 is not just caution, it is endurance. The fact that you are here, listening now, is proof that someone somewhere in that long dark century did not give up. They gathered herbs from frozen soil, they melted snow to drink, they spoke softly in the candlelight, and they chose, again and again, not to end the story. We carry their choices in our blood, their breath is in our lungs, their unmarked graves fertilize the earth beneath our homes. And so the year 536 lives on, not as a date in a textbook, but as a presence in the roots of our resilience. Time, like a river, does not stop for sorrow. It carries even the heaviest years downstream, wearing away their edges, softening their screams into echoes. And so the year 536 slipped into history, not with ceremony, but with silence. There were no great monuments built to mark its suffering, no marble arch proclaiming the absence of the sun. No tapestry stitched with the names of the fallen. It was a year remembered not in stone, but in shadow. And yet it shaped everything that came after. In the silence of that long twilight, the rhythm of civilization changed, trade routes shifted, dynasties rose and crumbled, languages evolved, faith deepened, and in time humanity forgot the year, but not the feeling it left behind. Every age of rebuilding carries the fingerprints of collapse. The Justinian plague, the famines, the darkened sky, each left invisible residue on the human soul. Perhaps that's why even now, in the quiet moments before dawn, when fog clings to the trees and the world feels still and strange, a part of us remembers. Not with words, but with instinct. The instinct to store, to prepare, to hold close what is precious, to light a single candle when darkness feels too vast, to whisper lullabies even when there is no one to hear. In the modern world, we often imagine ourselves distant from such ancient terrors. We walk brightly lit streets. We count calories instead of grains. We send messages across oceans in the time it once took to fetch water. And yet the earth remembers. Beneath our cities are layers of dust that once carried the dreams of empires. In our climate are scars from eruptions that no eye recorded. In our bodies is the legacy of plagues that reshaped who we are. What then do we make of 536? Not just the worst year to be alive, but perhaps the year that taught us what it means to remain. It is in these forgotten eras that the true miracle of humanity reveals itself, not in our conquests, but in our continuance. We are not here because we were the strongest. We are here because someone, in a village no longer marked on any map, chose to plant seeds even when the sun would not shine. Because someone else, wrapped in furs against the unseasonal frost, chose to sing to a child that had never seen spring. Because someone kneeling beside their sick stayed through the hunger, through the silence, through the shadow of a world turned inward. And so we inherit not just the earth they passed on, but the courage they whispered into it. There is a beauty in that, a holiness, not loud, but enduring. Somewhere the sun rose again. Not with fanfare, not with trumpets or joy, but with a gentle light that painted the sky gold for the first time in years. Somewhere a child squinted at it, confused, perhaps frightened. They had never seen such brightness. And an elder watching nearby wept silently, not from grief, but from memory. The world had endured. The famine slowly eased. Crops began to grow again, tentative and thin at first, but stronger with each passing season. Traders returned to broken roads. Bells were hung anew in churches, mosques and temples. The wind still carried the scent of ash, but it also carried birdsong. By the time the last embers of the 6th century faded, the skies had cleared. Not entirely, not always, but enough to remind humanity that the world still turned. And in the turning, hope. Even now, long after the names of emperors and kings have crumbled into dust, the traces of that forgotten catastrophe still linger in the margins of what we call civilization, in the old walls of ruined monasteries, in the deep frost lines beneath ancient soil, in lullabies whose origins no one remembers, but which soothe all the same. The year 5536 was not a single moment. It was a breath held across generations. A silence that forced us to listen, to nature, to each other, to the fragility of everything we build. And what we heard was the simple rhythm of survival. It is easy to dismiss the past as distant, to imagine those who lived before us as different creatures, less aware, less capable, less human. But they were like us. They hoped, they feared. They looked up at the same stars and longed for peace. They survived not because they understood the world, but because they loved someone in it enough to keep going. A sibling, a child, a neighbor, a story. And so now, as you rest, perhaps under modern lights, perhaps beneath stars hidden by clouds, know that the sky you live beneath once darkened for years. And still it found its way back to dawn. So too will we. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift. Let the weight of time settle gently around you. For tonight, we have wandered through one of history's darkest hours. And yet, we leave it not in sorrow, but in quiet reverence. Reverence for those who lit candles against the dark, reverence for the silence that shaped us, and reverence for the unseen hands that carried us through. Sleep well, traveller of time. You are here, and that is enough. When we speak of years, we imagine them neatly bound. 12 months, 4 seasons, a chapter cleanly closed. But the truth is, no year ends when its number does, especially not a year like 5 and 36. It was not a chapter. It was a deep, smouldering thread woven through the fabric of generations. Even long after the skies cleared, the consequences lingered, not just in the bones of weakened bodies or in the fragile economies of ruined cities, but in something quieter, deeper. It lingered in the way people built homes with thicker walls, in the way stories were passed from grandmother to grandchild, with caution threaded between the words, in the way eyes instinctively searched the sky, not for birds or weather, but for something gone wrong. There is a wisdom that comes from surviving what cannot be explained. It doesn't arrive like a revelation. It settles like sediment in a riverbed, slowly, steadily, until the course of the river itself has changed. The survivors of that age may not have understood volcanism, or pandemics, or climate cycles, but they understood fear. They understood the fragility of fortune, and in their bones they learned the rhythm of patience. Imagine a shepherd in the Syrian highlands, 40 winters after the Great Darkness. He has never seen the plague, never felt the frost of 5 of 36. And yet when his child asks why the family lights a candle each winter morning before sunrise, he only smiles. It is what we do, he says. He does not know that this ritual began in hunger and silence, that somewhere in his lineage someone lit that candle, not for tradition, but for hope. But the flame remembers. So much of what we do, what we believe, what we carry, comes not from what we are told, but from what our ancestors endured without explanation. There is a thread from that cold century that still winds through us now, in our quiet preparation, in our uneasy peace with nature's unpredictability, in our sudden urge to protect, to save, to hold close those we love when the skies grow strange. We are not alone in this. The earth remembers. It stores our stories in soil, in stone, in shadow, and so does the sky. There comes a point after the cold has passed and the famine has faded, when the world does not simply return. It becomes something new. The people of the 6th century did not rebuild what was. They created what had never been. And though the names of most are lost, unwritten, unspoken, swept away by time, their choices still shape us. Not because they were grand, but because they were tender. A mother who sang lullabies to a child too weak to eat. A healer who ground herbs into paste when nothing else remained. A mason who rebuilt a fallen wall, one stone at a time, though no coin was promised. A child who watched the sunrise and believed it meant tomorrow. These are the legacies that last. Not castles, not conquests, but care. If history teaches us anything, it is that even in our most fragile moments, we do not vanish. We transform. And so, if the world ever feels heavy in your hands, if the news flickers with uncertainty, if the seasons arrive strangely, if the silence grows louder than usual, remember we have been here before. We have sat in cold rooms and wondered if spring would return. We have knelt beside the sick and whispered prayers in trembling voices. We have stood beneath sunless skies and held each other anyway. The year 536 reminds us not of how close we came to collapse, but how quietly we chose to continue. So tonight, as the quiet folds around you, breathe. Not just for yourself, but for those who once lived in a world that forgot to bloom. Breathe for the unseen hands that stitched warmth from scraps and the quiet voices that told stories when there was nothing else to give. Breathe for the candle lit in darkness, and for the one who carried its flame across generations. The storm passed, the earth healed, the sun returned. And so it will again. Rest now, traveller. You are part of a long, unbroken line, not of warriors or kings, but of keepers of light. And somewhere just beyond the veil of sleep, the sky waits to open, bright, endless, and patient.